everyone. My name is Reagan Fitzke. I am a post-bac project manager at the Keck School of Medicine in Dr. Eric Peterson's lab. Thank you for having me today. I'll be talking about my project entitled Revisiting Trait Resilience in the Context of Harm Reduction and Exploration of Cannabis-Related Protective Behavioral Strategies and Consequences. So currently there's an increased interest in resilience as it relates to substance use in research. However, there are discrepancies on how studies operationalize resilience. A lot of studies define resilience as the absence of substance use after a traumatic event or stressor. However, I wanted to start with a quote from a recent review paper that kind of challenges that notion. That reads, "The concept of resilience, as it is currently utilized, is too restrictive and, in essence, leaves drug-using individuals out of the realm of its investigation, leading to a dearth of studies on resilience among people who use drugs." So this quote really highlights the importance of studying resilience among active drug users, especially when we consider how it can be used in the context of harm reduction among vulnerable groups. So one such group that's of concern when we're talking about substance use is college students. College students face a number of emotional health challenges, and these are attributed to factors such as academic, social, health, and financial stressors. There's also a robust literature examining the strong effect that peer normative influence has on substance use among college students. And this often manifests as students perceiving their peers to use substances pretty heavily, maybe more heavily than they actually do. And this can lead to overconsumption of substances in oneself. So taken together, these factors can put college students at risk for harmful substance use. And cannabis is one substance that is of recent concern, with use rates growing and much to be understood about its prevalence and effects in young adults. And as you can see from this data from the Monitoring the Future survey, there's an increase in both past year use and daily use in recent years. So protective behavioral strategies are one important component of harm reduction when it comes to cannabis use. And these include behaviors such as using marijuana only among your trusted peers, avoiding using marijuana to cope with emotions such as sadness or depression, or limiting your use to weekends, among a bunch of others. And there are many trait level factors that interact with PBS. And taken together, these can consistently be shown to reduce cannabis use consequences among vulnerable populations and cannabis users. However, no known studies examine how resilience itself may interact with protective behavioral strategies to mitigate use-related harm among users. So our study looked at 996 university students in Colorado, about a third of which were past 30-day cannabis users, and 117 of those were daily users. We first conducted a t-test comparing trait resilience in cannabis users versus non-users. Here, resilience is measured at the personality trait level. We then conducted a multiple regression or moderation model, investigating the interaction between trait level resilience and PBS as they associate with cannabis-related consequences. So first, our t-test showed no mean differences in trait level resilience among our sample of users and non-users. And here's the full brief resilience scale to give you a better idea of what trait resilience is actually getting at. But both groups of past 30-day cannabis users and non-past 30-day users had a mean score on the brief resilience scale at about a 3.3, which is a moderate score on the scale. Our initial stepwise regression results indicated that both resilience and PBS associated with fewer consequences independently. And when looking at the interaction effect, you can see that it's significant, such that high protective behavioral strategy use was associated with lower consequences pretty much across the board, shown by that blue line there. However, when we're looking at low levels of PBS, those who have both low levels of PBS and low levels of resilience experience the most consequences from cannabis use. And as you can see, as individuals who have low PBS tend to report higher levels of resilience, that gap in the amount of consequences experienced between the low PBS and high PBS group begins to diminish. So to expand on these findings a little bit, Our findings point to the notion that resilience is not necessarily exclusive to non-users and can be important when we're talking about harm reduction. Specifically, our hypothesis that PBS and resilience may be interconnected in mitigating consequences about cannabis users was supported. Specifically, when we're interpreting that interaction effect, those who have lower trait resilience may benefit from using more protective behavioral strategies. So targeted PBS interventions could be helpful for these individuals when reducing harm. And when I talk about PBS interventions, these are things like identifying more context in which somebody isn't using PBS and maybe encouraging them to use more PBS in those contexts, or identifying specific strategies that a person isn't using and encouraging them to use those in order to mitigate their cannabis use consequences. So our study had a few limitations. It was first limited by using a cross-sectional convenience sample. It was from a psychology subject pool at Colorado State University. So thus, any effects I'm talking about here are merely associative. So future studies could look at longitudinal data on this topic to establish more of a causal link. Though college students face a number of stressors that I was talking about, it's also important to consider what stressors and predecessors may actually be most salient for these individuals. So future studies may also want to look at different predictors of stress in these models when predicting resilience. We also only examined resilience at the trait level. However, there are definitely important external factors as well when we're talking about resilience. And these are things like social support, which some studies have termed as resilience resources. And these are external factors that can help bolster a person's resilience when we're talking about their ability to bounce back. So future studies should also investigate these important outcomes. Lastly, I wanted to note that resilience can be a helpful tool, but it's not necessarily a Band-Aid solution. And we want to be careful to not put the onus on victims of systemic issues such as racism, discrimination, socioeconomic injustice, and other inequities to bounce back. And instead, we should focus on those root issues and what's causing the problem in the first place. Resilience can be a powerful tool and it can be empowering, but it can also be harmful. So we have to really consider when and why we're talking about it in order to best serve the communities that we're researching. All right, real quick, I just wanted to give a quick thanks to my study team at USC and Colorado State University. No funding was obtained for the study. And that's all. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Could you expand a little bit on, you were talking, I mean, you talked very quickly, it was excellent, but about resilience being harmful and when it is harmful, just expanded, that's kind of a novel concept.
Yeah, so you would like me to talk a little bit more on that? Okay, yeah, so there's been some criticisms on how resilience is talked about, especially when we're considering groups that faced systemic issues like racism or discrimination. And when we talk about resilience in those groups, we want to be careful to say resilience can be a powerful tool, but also it's not the solution here necessarily. The solutions should be addressed at the root level. So when we're talking about those systemic issues, we don't want to put the onus on people who are, for example, like if we're talking about a homeless population and we give that homeless person a resilience intervention, that person might benefit from that, but what they would really benefit from the most is resources to help them alleviate their situation that they're currently in. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so if the focus is just on resilience, then it might be harmful. And that's some of the criticism that's coming out of the current research. And that's because the focus needs to be pointed elsewhere. Does that make sense?
So I have two questions. I guess one is, my original question was on, maybe I missed it, but when the graph where you showed cannabis consequences, how are those, what are they and how are they classified?
What are you talking about?
Yeah, that one. So,
Here?
yeah, what is that?
Yeah,
the
so
axis?
cannabis consequences are just a series of consequences from cannabis use, things that people experience after cannabis use, things like, feeling fatigued the day after, or getting social backlash from your cannabis
So that's like
use.
a standard set of criteria?
Yes,
And-
yes. So
and-
there's I believe we use the marijuana consequences scale
Okay.
for this. Yeah.
So that was my original question, but actually thinking about resilience, I actually thought about this when you did, you introduced the demographics, which was a college population. Don't you think there's like a bias there about resilience in a group of college students? I mean, for example, you mentioned socioeconomics and things like that. Do you think that there's you mentioned in your limitations that it wasn't cross-sectional enough. Did you mean sectional enough within that group, or do you mean in general?
I think one, like there are definitely limitations with looking at a college student sample, as you were saying. However, this is a group that does have pretty heavy cannabis use. So we do think that while like it's obviously important to look at other groups as well, outside of a college student population, that this is a group that is often targeted when it comes to cannabis use.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
disagree that with the usage. I guess that my question was
Yeah.
more around the resilience piece to it. Right? Is there a bias towards resilience by selecting that group to study?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm not really sure how to answer that.
It just a thought, because you did mention like homeless people or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, there's lots of other populations that probably have a whole different way to measure resilience.
Mhm.
And if you're measuring it in college students, I would think that there's an inherent bias there. But
Sure. Yeah.
that was it. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Reagan. Next